I'm looking for information on the night Marauder. If anyone could help me, I would appreciate it.
Hello, this is Megan from Travelers Paranormal, completing the 17th challenge of the Paragames, the Serial Killer Challenge. For my challenge, I chose the Night Marauder from East Tennessee, specifically Knox and Blount County, in 1919 to 1926, as my subject. While I was researching this serial killer, I found a very helpful work, which was the blog site put together by Dr. Nancy Laughlin-Sofer. Dr. Nancy Laughlin-Sofer is a professor at Maryville College who is teaching a course on the history of murder. Some of the things that they were focusing on was the different ability of the 1920s versus now in researching and investigating crimes, specifically fingerprinting, blood types and toxicology, DNA, ballistics testing, criminal profiling. These were not tools that they had at the time. An interesting topic that she goes into is just the ability for police to get out of their own way, basically. At this time, they still had a set idea as to how murders happened, how murderers chose their targets, and the idea of someone being random was not something that they saw as a possibility. They also had to find ways to look at these crimes differently. Also discussing, again, with not having fingerprints and all of that, that they were left largely to rely on eyewitness testimony, which could vary in its reliability. The first portion of the attacks from 1919 to 1921 primarily took place in Knoxville. Part of the confusion over even linking these Night Marauder attacks together was the presence of another serial break-in person who was nicknamed Pants. Pants would break into a house, steal the man's pants, go out onto the front porch, look through the pockets, take whatever they found, and leave. This person had attacked the Spessard sisters on May 3rd, 1919, and also attacked Vance Stamps on May 10th. No one was hurt, no one was killed, but these were a series of break-ins that were happening, and robbery seemed to be the motive. The official first Night Marauder attack is of Della Wagner, also referred to as Delia Wagner, that I found. She was attacked on May 8th, 1919. She was staying with her sister and her brother-in-law when she woke up to a man in her room. She called for the police and he threatened her. When she screamed, he shot at her, and then he left. She claimed that she saw him and she could identify him from the house that was outside, the light that was outside of the house. All of these houses that were attacked were houses that did not have electricity yet. She claims that her attacker was Robert McNish. He was a local man who would often be seen carrying a holy Bible and a songbook, he said. That was all that he carried when he was there. She had thought that he was stalking her, but he was eventually released. She renounced her identification of him and believed that she was incorrect. And he didn't fit the attack of a violent person, having been claiming a pacifist. The next attack was that of Bertie Lindsay. Bertie was attacked on August 30th, 1919, early in the morning, as many of the others were. She was sharing a room with her cousin because her husband was away for work, And you're going to see that this is a common theme throughout these attacks where the husbands, if there were husbands, were working the night shift or were just away. Again, she would have woken up to someone touching her and she would have been threatened. She tried to escape and she screamed, but she was shot. The intruder turned and started threatening her cousin, but then ran. The cousin told the police that they were attacked by a black man. Now, an interesting note is that some of the later crimes, they found soot or some other blackening device at the crime scenes, which implied that this may have been someone who was trying to hide their identity. The cousin went to a neighbor's house and got his wife, and they saw that the man was running away, and they were able to track his footprints because the ground was very muddy. The person that they ended up accusing, one of the policemen who came, ended up accusing was Maurice Mays. Maurice was born on May 8th, 1887, and adopted by the Mays family. His mother was named Ella Walker, and she was a maid. His father was semi-openly, I guess, identified as Johnny McMillan, who at the time of this killing was the mayor of Knoxville. McMillan had a financial interest in Mays growing up. He funded some of his business projects, and in return, Mays advocated for McMillan among the black residents. And that was a large way that McMillan managed to rely on to win the vote to be the mayor. Mays also owned the Strollers Cafe, which is a club which was notable because the patrons were black and white. It was known as a club where liquor poured freely. It was referred to as the Black and Tan, again, because of the mixed patronage. From what I could find, he had been a deputy sheriff for a period of time. In fact, in 1904, he shot a man in self-defense because he was helping the police break up an illegal gambling ring. He married a woman named Maddie Douglas on July 1st, 1917, but they did separate before any of this occurred. Just a little bit of an idea as to the environment around. Maurice Mays being arrested led to race riots in and around Knoxville, but tensions were high before that. Knoxville had prided itself on a city of fairness and equity. There were a lot of good-paying jobs. After World War I, a lot of black soldiers came and moved there to start their lives. Showing how good it was, but also how much needed to be done, the city would brag on the fact that black citizens could vote, they could hold public office, they could sit on juries, and they could be on the police force. Charles Chancellor, the principal of Knoxville Colored High School, and a friend of Booker T. Washington, wrote, "In no place in the world can there be found better relations existing between the races than here in our own county of Knox. No race riots have ever disgraced our city, and no mob has ever vented its fury here upon any Negro victim." As the soldiers were returning from World War I, though, they began taking some of the jobs, and so started to see a slight economic downturn. The tensions were starting to grow, and part of seeing that is that the NAACP and the KKK both established offices in Knoxville at the same time in August of 1913. Maurice Mays was arrested for the attack on Bertie Lindsay and her cousin. He was convicted very quickly based on very little information and inconsistent facts. As I noted before, the neighbor and the cousin were able to see footprints in the deep mud. However, when he was gotten by those police officers that night, there was no mud on his shoes and no dirt on his clothes, despite having run through to escape what would have been a couple of feet worth of weeds. A gun was found in his house, but no flashlight, and that is, again, a hallmark trait of the night marauder. He would wake the women up by placing his hands on their legs or ankles. He would immediately shine a flashlight in their eyes and threaten them that if they screamed, he would shoot them. The policemen who arrested him were Andy White and Jim Smith. Before they even went there, Andy White had apparently said to Jim Smith that he believed it was Maurice Mays, and he was known to have a grudge against Maurice Mays. Once they arrested him, they brought him baback to the scene of the crime, and they brought Maurice Smith outside of the house And they had to support her because she was still in a state of shock. And there's accounts saying that Maurice Mays told Jim Smith to just have him stay underneath the streetlight so she could get a really good look at him. And when she came out, she was just like in a state of shock. She was being supported. And she said, he's the one who did it. And Maurice Mays supposedly said something to the effect of, no, miss, please look again. You'll see I am not the person who did this. But Andy White had heard all that he wanted. So they arrested Maurice Mays based on the eyewitness testimony of a woman that was in shock, had just seen her cousin killed, had just been attacked herself. Sheriff W.T. Cate was in charge of the jail, and he requested that Mays be moved into protective custody in Chattanooga. He could see that the anger was already running. The first newspaper that ran said that there was a unnamed person in custody, but the second run printed his name and identified him as a black man. Deputy Sheriff Carol Cate and jailer Earl Hall were the ones that were in the jail that night as a crowd gathered outside. They actually allowed people to come in small groups trying to prove that he was not there, but the people were just angry. It grew to a crowd of about 5,000 that kept on insisting that Mays was hidden inside. They ended up breaking down the riot doors of the jail with dynamite, just exploding it and going in and ransacking the jail. While they said that they were interested in justice, they ended up releasing the 16 white prisoners that were there, including at least 4 convicted murderers. At around 8:30, they were outside of where the black inmates were kept, and that's where Deputy Frank York was standing his ground. He had a gun, and he threatened that he was going to shoot anyone if they even came closer to him. And despite the fact that Deputy Sheriff Carol Cate, the nephew of Sheriff W.T. Cate, had made a similar threat earlier, this time the crowd believed him, and they did back off. So they did not get into where the black prisoners were. They did, however, steal a whiskey still and all of the whiskey and firearms that they could find inside the jail. There were 2 platoons of the National Guard's 4th Infantry that had been sent to the jail to assist, but because it was a holiday weekend, they had been on leave, and so they basically got there after everything had happened. The crowd had moved from the jail to a town center, and so the National Guard went there to try to get them to disperse. Several truckloads of men were loaded, and they went to Chattanooga to try to find Mays. Meanwhile, as these tempers were flaring, the black citizens of Knoxville had seen the writing on the wall, and they had begun to build a barricade. They had purchased ammunition and guns if they didn't have them, and they were getting prepared to defend their families and their stores and such. So the mob was now in the center when they heard gunshots, and someone in the crowd started yelling that the black people were shooting people. And so now the whole mob moved towards the black side of town. And once they got there, the National Guard set up 2 machine guns, and they ended up in having a full-on riot. The black people were trying to defend their families and their businesses, and the white mob had a target now. During the shooting, the immediate official account only had 2 people dead. One was James William Payne, a National Guard lieutenant, who had been fired on and injured, and he had stumbled when he was injured, and he ended up walking in front of the National Guard's machine guns. A second person who was killed during this riot was a gentleman named Joe Etter. He had been a soldier in the Spanish-American War, and he was shot when he tried to single-handedly capture one of those machine guns that were firing into Vine Street and into the residential areas. Eventually, the National Guard took charge. 200 white citizens were deputized to assist, and they went through and searched the area to make sure that there was no more danger. At this point, there's a question as to what the full death toll was. Deputy Carol Cate estimated between 25 to 30. A National Guard Majors said that it might have been 30 to 40, and others said it was as high as the hundreds. 55 white rioters were charged with minor offenses, but all were acquitted. After this, Maurice Mays was put on trial very quickly, and he was convicted of murder. There was an appeal, and his trial was overturned. It was based on a technicality because the judge had sentenced him to death, but there had been a law where the jury had to do it. So they retried him. It was equally fast, and he was again found guilty and charged and sentenced to death. On March 15, 1922, at 6:12, Mays was electrocuted, and he was pronounced dead at 6:16 at the Tennessee State Prison in Nashville. Also notably, John McMillan, his supposed father, committed suicide in 1926. He had lost the election after this. Morris' conviction allowed the crimes to continue as they were a distraction from further investigations. His final words were, "I am as innocent as the sun that shines." There are efforts ongoing for his exoneration, and I am going to link the website in the description of this video. So the next attack was Ida and Dan White on September 13th, 1919. Again, Dan worked nights, so Ida was at home without him, just as in several of these. After that, the next attack was Stacy and Henry Ward on September 25th, 1919. Again, Henry was away working the night shift. His teenage sister Roxy and little brother were also in the house. Stacy said the attacker said if she screamed, he would shoot her as he had done before. She did scream, and he did shoot her, and then he fled out the window. Next was Nettie Pinkham, October 1st, 1919. She was sharing her bed with her 5-year-old daughter. She woke up to a man's hands on her legs, and he threatened to shoot her, as he had shot that other woman. At this point, she tried to find a match to light a light, and he began hitting her. Her daughter tried to defend her, and the attacker threw her against the wall. And this is another time where we have note of another preparation that the night marauder did. Before he woke up the woman, he would also grab any matches and hide them. On January 20th, 1920, we have Mary and Elijah McGill. Again, Elijah worked nights similar to the others. His sister Annie was sleeping in the same room as Mary, and they had a boarding couple, the Johnsons, that were asleep in a different room. Mary called for the Johnsons when she woke up, and the intruder shot at her and Annie and then left. Now, this is interesting because, again, at this point, they were able to be saved. 6 months later, however, it seems that they were attacked again. But it was revealed that Elijah, at that point, murdered Mary because he was having an affair with Belle Cox and he had been caught, and he wanted to frame it as a night marauder attack. He was convicted of first-degree murder with all but one juror voting for the death penalty. He never admitted his guilt. The next night marauder attack was May 24th, 1920, on Miss Joy Thomas. She was 14 years old, sharing her room with her 2 little sisters. She remarks that the man told her that she was too young to kill, but if she screamed, he would still shoot her. After that was Miss Alma Booker, June 1st, 1920. Alma was only 13 years old. She was sleeping alone in a downstairs room. Again, she was threatened to be shot if she screamed, but she did scream and then she fainted. And when she woke up, she ran to her parents' room. Next was Mrs. Mattie McCall, July 22nd, 1920. She lived with her 22-year-old son, but he was, again, away working the night shift. She was assaulted, and she remarked that, as she could recall, the person attacking her was wearing gloves, corduroy, and was probably white. And there's several different descriptions of him from these attackers. Some of them say he's a darker-skinned, complexioned white man. Some say he's a light-skinned black man. Again, they found soot or other skin blackening materials at some of these crime scenes, kind of indicating that the night marauder was trying to hide their identity. At 54 years old, she was the oldest victim so far. Next was Mrs. Mildred Young. She was attacked on July 30th, 1920. She was separated from her husband because he was away working on the railroad. When she woke up, she screamed, and the intruder again threatened to shoot her if she screamed again. She did scream, and he did make good on his threat Worried that she would die, she quickly blurted out that she believed her attacker was Carl Stevens, a deserter from the U.S. Army. He was held without trial pending her recovery, but she withdrew her charges as she recovered, saying that she actually didn't see the attacker very well. The next attack was Miss Maud Maples on August 10th, 1920. She was staying with a friend named Hazel Brummel in the house of Katie and Henderson Radcliffe. She was going through a separation with her husband. At the time, she and Hazel had been hanging out that day, and so she just stayed over at Hazel's house. Initially, when she was asked who attacked her, she said it was Henderson Radcliffe, but as she sobered up and thought through it, she had said it was him because he was the only man that she could think of that was in the house. Testimony and evidence exonerated Radcliffe. However, that night, the attacker was not done. He had been interrupted from attacking Maud, and so he moved on to his next attack, which was on Lula Eunice and Elizabeth Robinson. Again, in this case, the husband was away at work. Lula was staying in a room with her sister-in-law, Elizabeth. At about 3 a.m., Elizabeth reports that she woke to see a man at the foot of Lula's bed. She said that she wasn't sure if Lula screaming or a gunshot woke her up, but regardless, Lula was screaming, and the intruder shot her about 3 times as she continued to scream. The intruder then assaulted Elizabeth as Lula lay dying. Lula clung to life for 2 days before she finally succumbed to her injuries. His next attack was Ruth Cox, September 21st, 1920. She was a 16-year-old living with her father, and she was sharing her bed with her little sister. The intruder came in and woke her up, again in the same fashion of holding onto her legs. She called for her father, and the intruder shot at her, but then ran. The father believed that they were attacked and that the motive was robbery because he said, quote, he couldn't imagine any other motive. Next attack was Annie Key, September 21st, 1920. She lived with her father, and when she woke to the flashlight in her eyes, jumped out of bed and called for her father, and the intruder ran. On September 21st, 1920, perhaps frustrated from not having been able to attack Annie, he moved on to Alice Burnett and Eula Henry, who were guests staying in the house of Miss R.C. Hamilton. Alice had been engaged to Mrs. Hamilton's son, Ross, but he had been killed at a work accident at the L&N Railroads. This woman, Mrs. Hamilton, suffered, as I just said, she had already lost her son. Her husband had died in 1912, and her daughter had died in 1914. So through those tragedies, Alice Burnett had grown close to her, and so they kept in touch even though Ross had passed away. The intruder told Alice Burnett that she would be killed if they did not obey him, and also Eula Henry, that they would both be killed if they did not obey him. Miss Henry fought for the gun, and they rolled onto the floor. And then Lula jumped into action. She grabbed the gun herself and went to attack him. There were 2 gunshots fired in the struggle. One shot Miss Burnett in the sleeve, but the other one caught her in the side. She went through 3 hours of surgery, but 2 days later she still died from her injuries. Next attack was Miss Lillian Bales. She was attacked on January 4th, 1921. She lived with her 2 daughters, Ada, 19, and Cleo, 16. She was the widow of a former deputy sheriff. Again, as with others, she woke up to a man pulling back covers on the bed and grabbing her legs, and all 3 of them screamed. She screamed, woke the girls, who also screamed. The intruder left, foiled. The police were able to trace the footsteps back to 2 other houses. One was not entered, but the other was the home of Clay Henry. It seemed that some money was stolen from him, and it's notable because this was the same home that Maud Maples had been attacked in. She just was not living there anymore. And so the question is, was he remembering his former frustration at Maud Maples and trying to go back to that house? On July 5th, he ended up going to several different houses. The first was that of John Condon, but he was interrupted when John caught him attacking the daughter. And then he went to the house of Miss Solanus Yates. She screamed and ran out of the house, getting away from him. Then he went to Miss Donna Daniels. She screamed and jumped out the window as he shot at her. Then he went to the house of J.T. Leidenhammer, who shouted at him and called for the police. The intruder shot Leidenhammer in the arm, but then still left. At this point, having gone to 4 different houses and being unable to get any victims from them, he went to the house of Miss Ethel Wilson. She woke up to someone in her kitchen, and she was assaulted. His next attack, however, did end in a murder. He attacked Ida and Georgia Tilson on August 1st, 1921. Ida was 21 years old and Georgia was 15, and they were sharing a bed in the front room of the house. Now, normally Georgia and her younger sister Ruby slept there, but Ruby had fallen asleep in Ida's bed, so Ida, instead of waking up the little sister, had just taken her place. Again, they woke up to a man crawling into bed with them, grabbing their legs and crawling into bed. He tried to attack Ida first, but she was fighting back with him. He threatened her that he was going to attack Georgia instead, and so Ida fought harder. He ended up shooting her, and then he left. When their father came in, he found Georgia crying and holding on to Ida. She died 2 hours later, though, from her wounds. Georgia remained in a state of shock for an extended time after this. A week later, her uncle said he did see a man prowling around the outside of the house. Later on, when they had another suspect in custody, she was one of the women who was shown a picture of the suspects, and she did identify the prime suspect. Next attack was on Blanche Raby on August 3rd, 1921. She was 17 years old, and she was a cotton mill worker, living with her mother and her stepfather. The attacker timed this badly. It was much earlier in the night than normal, and when he went into the house, she was in the kitchen preparing a fire, so she attacked him with a hatchet. He shot at her and missed. Raby said that she was pretty certain the attacker was a white man with a dark complexion, she said. After that, he went after Miss Ruby Walker, also 17 years old. She lived with her parents and her 4 younger siblings. She said that he tried to assault her, but she fought back, and he fired at her. Luckily for her, though, he missed, and then he ran away. Next attack was Miss William Bailey on October 25th, 1921. She woke up again, same thing, with a man grabbing her legs, threatening her that if she screamed, he would shoot her, and he assaulted her. Her husband was there during the attack, and she reported that the intruder had threatened her husband to not move, and her husband did indeed not move. After this, a gentleman named Luther Saffel was arrested, and he admitted to being in the neighborhood. However, he had a solid alibi and multiple witnesses to prove that he was not the attacker. Apparently, after the attack on Miss William Bailey, even though he successfully assaulted her, he was not done, and he went and attacked Mr. and Mrs. Robert Schubert. She, again, woke to someone grabbing her ankles, and in this case, Mr. Schubert had gone to attack him, and he had run away. And then also, he attacked Margaret Lane, who was a widow living with her son William, his wife, and their baby son. Margaret caught the intruder as he was coming in, and he just quickly fled. Next, on October 31st, 1921, Miss R.S. Schultz woke to an intruder in her home. He attempted to assault her, but again, she fought back. He fired her, but he missed. On November 7th, 1921, was another night where he was met with some frustration. First, he tried to attack the Gladson family, but they heard him at the door, so he ran away before he even got into the house. Next, Mrs. Carmichael woke up, saying that there was a man in her room beside her bed, but she and her husband both woke up, and so they got away. And then next, he attacked the Hook family. They found signs of a break-in that was attempted, but he was not able to get into their house. However, he also went to the house of Bertie and Lester Dooley. Lester was a twice honorably discharged 30-year-old veteran that had served in World War I. He had children from a previous marriage that were living in Georgia. He and Bertie had only been married in September of that same year, so only for about 2 months. They woke up to a sound at the window and took an axe that they were keeping by the bed for protection. They didn't see anything, so they went back to sleep. An hour later, the intruder was in their room. Lester tried to stop him from assaulting Bertie, but the attacker shot Lester and then ran away while Bertie just continued screaming. And she followed him out onto the porch screaming. Lester's description matched that of the Carmichaels of a white man using something to blacken his face, and he reported that he also thought the man was wearing a fake black mustache. On November 25th, 1921, the next victim was Arthur Young. The Young house was attempted to be entered, but the family inside realized that there was someone there and they had alerted the police. And so Police Captain J.J. Schneider and Patrolman Clifton had gone to the house to try to see who was going on. Now, on September 21st, 1920, the Commissioner of Public Safety, N.B. Coleman, had issued a statement to the police chief, Ed M. Haynes, to begin a curfew. Anyone found on the streets at night was supposed to be arrested, unless they could show a reason as to why they were out. Knoxville Mayor E.W. Neal held a vote, and that curfew was passed unanimously. By September 23rd, law enforcement was growing further frustrated. They hadn't caught anyone, but they were also targeting drug addicts and dope fiends, insisting that these were the people who committed violent crimes. Again, the idea that someone was just randomly attacking people didn't make sense to them, so they thought that this was someone who really still was primarily trying to get money. So fast forward again to November 25th, 1921, when someone had been caught trying to break into the Young home. A man named John Honeycutt had gone out to risk the curfew because he said he needed to get some whiskey. He heard the policeman and he went to hide, but he was seen as he was out there. He was arrested, and one of the policemen had been shot in the lung and recovered by the intruder. He was arrested for that gunshot. He was found guilty of shooting the police officer. He was not charged with the crime of breaking into the Young house, and he was not charged with any crimes related to the night Marauder. He was just charged with shooting a police officer as he fled. And he was found guilty for that, and then they were beginning to build a case for him for the night Marauder crimes, but he died in prison before actually being tried for any of those murders. This attack on the Young house is the last attack in Knoxville. After this, the Marauder moved on to Blount County, where he would continue his attacks, primarily in Maryville and Alcoa. Alcoa is a company town named for the Aluminum Company of America, which was headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So his first attack now in Blount County was on Miss Mary McCampbell, June 15, 1922. And this one is kind of an outlier. She is the matron of the Blount County Children's Home. So this is not a private residence, and there's a lot more people there to potentially catch him. But she found the intruder as she was walking around making her nightly rounds. That same night, 3 or 4 other break-ins took place in that area, which kind of goes with the tendency to break into other homes if he gets foiled. On March 23rd, 1923, the next official night Marauder case is on Ressie Allison. She woke up again to a man grabbing her, shining a flashlight in her eyes, and threatening her. She called for her father and was told to be quiet or that he would kill her. She attempted to call for the boarder, Mr. Walker, who slept in the next room, but the intruder overpowered her and assaulted her and then fled. On April 27, 1923, a woman named Grace Martin Walker was attacked. She fought back, but she was still assaulted. But she did say that she would be able to recognize the voice of her attacker. Also, Myrtle Cook was attacked in late April, her husband again away at the night shift. She asserted as well that she would be able to identify his voice. On July 5th, 1923, Mr. and Mrs. Sam Lawson both yelled when they heard an intruder entering their house, and he fled. He then moved on to attack Sam and Lizzie Reagan. They were asleep in one room, and Sam's brother Alan and his wife Martha were asleep in another. Lizzie woke to a man entering the house from the front porch. She thought it was Alan threatening Martha, so she woke up Sam. She looked again and realized it was not Alan, but the intruder, having had other people in the house woken up, fled. And then he went after Carter Roberts. When Carter heard an intruder, he confronted him again before he even got into the house, and so he fled. Then he went on to Lon Bible. Lon Bible lived with his mother-in-law, Mrs. J.A. Sharp. His mother-in-law woke up with a man standing over her, and she called for Lon to get his gun. He tried to light a lamp, but he found that the matches were all hidden. Again, this was another hallmark of the night marauder. He charged at the intruder anyway, and the intruder turned and fired but fled. Luckily for Lon, he missed. At around this time, John McCampbell, the sheriff of Blount County, he was very focused on catching this criminal now that he had come into his jurisdiction. And the criminal actually sent a letter to him taunting him that he was not going to be caught. In this letter, he lists his victims. And interestingly enough, he includes the name Dora Davis. Dora Davis is not one of the night marauder murders. Dora Davis was killed in 1915. This letter is signed by J.J. Emery, and notably, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Cusick saw an unknown horseman riding by in the night. He called to the man, asking him who it was, and the man replied, "I'm Joe Emery." Cusick reported later that he suspected that this was Will Scheffy. Will Scheffy was a young man who was childhood friends with Dora Davis. Now, with this letter, John McCampbell, the sheriff, just happened to show this letter to Dr. Cusick, who he also knew. Dr. Cusick saw it and told him about the suspicions around Will Scheffy at the time of Dora Davis being killed. Will Scheffy was from what was described as a good family. Ida Scheffy was the matriarch, and she had 4 children: Josie, Maggie, Thomas Phillip, and Will. The father died when Will was only about 6 or 7. He grew up working and helping out on the Davis farm, and again, that's where he met Dora. He was arrested for Dora's murder in 1915, but he was acquitted. He was drafted in 1917 and served as a medic in World War I, but he actually got overseas after the ceasefire had been called. While he was at Camp Green, North Carolina, training, he met Carol Sykes, and they married on August 28, 1918. He was known to have cheated on her while he was overseas, and then he and Carol moved to Maryville when he came back from the service, and he began working for Alcoa. On February 8, 1921, Carol gave birth to a baby boy named William, but she died from complications of childbirth, and Will sent his son to Ida to be raised. After that, and very quickly after that, 2 months later, he married Ruby G. McNutt. She ran away, stating that she was afraid of him, and during this time, he had an affair with another woman. She divorced him in 1925, and he moved back in with his mother. He had also been thrown out of school for assaulting a young girl at that time. So going back to Dora Davis, a potential reason for Will to have attacked her is that in 1913 he had proposed to her, but she had turned him down. He kept on trying to see her, but eventually her father ordered him not to come near Dora anymore. On September 1st, 1915, Dora was shot while in bed, in the same bed as her mother and her siblings. The bullet hit her in the throat, but she still continued to scream. She still managed to scream. The detectives brought in bloodhounds, and those dogs led them to Will Scheffy's house. Many were surprised he was arrested because he was from what was termed a good family. Preliminary hearings started on September 17, 1915. Will's uncle and several other judges were present on Will's legal team. It was here that Dr. Cusick testified to encountering an unknown horseman, as I said, who presented himself as Joe Emery. His mother and his siblings gave him solid alibis for the murder, and so on October 16, 1915, he was acquitted of the charges. Fast forwarding again back to the night marauder, we have December 10, 1923, Luther and Ada Wells. Luther and Ada were just 18 years old, and they'd only been married for about 8 months. Ada woke again, as many others did, to a man touching her ankles, and he ordered her to not scream, otherwise he would shoot her. He told Luther to step away and let him attack her, but Luther did not, and he ended up being shot 3 times. As he lay unconscious, Ada was assaulted. She screamed and she resisted him, so he shot her, but she continued screaming and he fled. She chased him out onto the front porch, screaming until she finally collapsed in pain. John Whitehead, their neighbor, reported that the shooter was gone before he reached the house. He had been alerted by Ada's screams. Luther and Ada both required long surgeries. When Ada was recovering and stable, she told the police that she was very certain she would be able to identify his voice. Despite Luther and Ada both describing the attacker as white, the police at first focused on the attacker being a black man. After they finally stopped thinking that, they suspected Charlie Reed, a former suitor of Ada. Again, Ada insisted that that was not who it was, but this goes back to the police kind of being stuck in there thinking that murder and attempted murder or violent crimes such as assault were done not randomly but by people who knew each other. Luther died on September 20th, 1924, almost a year later, and they said it was from complications of the original surgery. On March 3rd, 1924, Jim Pace caught the night marauder attempting to enter his house and was fired on, but the bullets missed. Deputy Gus Davis and Sheriff John McCampbell again saw to it that Pace was okay, and then they planned to stake out Will Scheffy's house. Again, Sheriff McCampbell was very certain that this was the work of Will Scheffy, especially after having spoken to Dr. Cusick. They commandeered a taxi driven by Fred Ballard, but unfortunately he was not used to being on police stakeouts, and so when they told him to just sit and wait while they went over to the house, snuck over to the house, he just drove down the road. And he ended up honking at a car that was coming at him, and that car was driven by Will Scheffy. So Will Scheffy got into the house and locked the door before the police could get there. And they gave up because he would be able to dispose of any evidence that he might have had. Next attack was on August 8th, 1924, on attack on Miss Birchfield. She lived in the home, she was a boarder in the home of Mr. Tipton. Again, she woke to saying that there was a man touching her with a flashlight and gun, demanding her to behave. If she screamed, he would shoot her. She screamed anyway, and he fired at her, but he missed. Mr. Toole, a neighbor out on his front porch, saw a man running and asked the man about the gunshots, and the man replied, "There were no shots," and continued running. Next, October 17th, 1924, Mrs. Reba Littlefield. He broke in and threatened her. This attack was officially listed as a breaking and entering, but like many others, she said she could identify his voice. And for the first trial, she did identify the voice of Will Scheffy. That year, Jim McCampbell lost his election for sheriff to a man named Walter Pate. But Jim McCampbell was very focused on still wanting to solve this crime wave. He was obsessed with it. He was spending his own money to pursue the criminal, going outside of the funds that the city and county would give to him. The night intruder, Will Scheffy, was equally obsessed with the sheriff, standing outside of his house on December 1st, 1923, for at least a few moments before he left. Also, the night intruder was obsessed with Jim McCampbell. In that letter that he had sent claiming to be J.J. Emery, he had been taunting the sheriff specifically. On December 1st, Clyde and Laura Poe were attacked. Clyde was a 21-year-old described as a hard-working farmer who he and Laura had only been married for about a year, and they had a 4-month-old son. Again, Laura woke when she felt a man's hands on her legs. Flashlight was shining in her eyes, and she was told that if she screamed, she would be killed. Clyde rushed to her defense, and the intruder shot him. The bullet paralyzed his lower body, but he continued trying to defend Laura by crawling across the floor to reach his gun. He fired while the intruder was assaulting Laura. The attacker fought again with Clyde for the shotgun, and then he fled the house. Laura noticed that the matches were gone as she went to light a fire so that she could see and care for Clyde. She got Clyde up onto the bed, and then she ran for help. She went next door to the house of Glenn Moore, who called the police. Sheriff Pate met Laura at the hospital. Whereas McCampbell was as certain that the attacker was Will Scheffy, Pate talked to the Poes, and he ended up coming to the impression that it was Wright Saffel, a teenager that Laura and Clyde mentioned had been obsessed with Laura. The attendants at the hospital thought Clyde might recover, but he developed pneumonia, and on December 17th, they thought he was recovered enough from the pneumonia to try to finally remove the bullet from his spine, but he ended up passing away during the surgery. Further tragedy for Laura: in May of 1925, Clyde Jr., the baby that they had, died of rickets and colitis. They assumed that it was partially due to malnutrition, as she was struggling after the death of her husband to take care of the baby. Laura Poe, like Ada Wells, is one of the women who went on to testify against Will Scheffy when he was charged with a crime. They were noted to be remarkable in that they had survived their traumas and were willing to speak candidly about what happened publicly. A lot of the women that were assaulted did not want to testify. So Wright Saffel was a 15-year-old at the time. He's the one who Sheriff Pate first went after for the attack on Laura Poe and Clyde Poe. But he had a very solid alibi and was released. And Laura, in fact, eventually said she did not actually think that it was him who had attacked her. She was pretty certain she would be able to recognize the voice, but she did not recognize the person. So a large step in solving this crime came about by the introduction of a private investigator. So a little background. The town of Alcoa, I had said before, was actually short for the Aluminum Company of America. This was a company town, and Mayor Sam Everett of Maryville had been very excited to bring it there. They had taken North Maryville to be a site of a new smelting facility, and in 1914, it was set aside to become Alcoa. They were attracted in a large part by the hydroelectric capability of the Little Tennessee River, as smelting required a great deal of electricity. Victor Jonas Holtquist was sent to oversee the construction of the city as the first city manager, and he was still the city manager at the time of these attacks. The city was incorporated in 1919. It was originally planned to be 150 houses, and there was supposed to be a 1-acre park for every 100 residents. They also wanted to have a town pool and a garden. The company built schools for the black and the white children, and they also built the only hospital in the area. Now, this trend of company houses and company towns was popping up anywhere where there was a big site across America, basically. Companies would come in and they would build residential areas nearby their plants. This had two different effects. It provided a workforce living close to the site so that in the need of extra workers or something, people would be able to be called into quickly. They would be guaranteed to get to work because they were close by. And also having schools and parks and residential areas encouraged families to come and seek out these positions. And the companies believed that these people would be more stable and more motivated. Importantly, what this also provided was companies which kept private detectives on their payroll. So as the attacks were coming into Alcoa, Holtquist turned to the company for assistance. He reached out to Edwin S. Fix in Pittsburgh, the headquarters. He wasn't sure that they had anyone with murder experience, but he authorized Holtquist to do whatever he needed to do to find the killer. Fix then reached out to one of the managers in St. Louis, Mr. C.B. Fox. C.B. Fox wrote to Holtquist on December 15th that he had found the private investigator for the job, a gentleman by the name of Fred C. Henriksen. He was the chief of plant security in East St. Louis, Illinois, and Fox wrote of him that he has worked for us for over 8 years on all sorts of jobs, and we know he is absolutely safe and reliable and has splendid judgment. Henriksen's plan was to open a sign painting shop in Alcoa and check into a hotel under an alias. Holtquist suggested the name Edward Jones. Upon Henriksen's arrival, he met with Holtquist, and even though McCampbell was not the sheriff, they very quickly brought him into the investigation. And then the three of them would work together. One of their first actions was to visit Laura Poe, who Henriksen determined would be an excellent witness, as she spoke very frankly about the attack. Importantly, it was at this time where she stated that she was very certain that the attacker was not Wright Saffel. Former Sheriff McCampbell, already very focused on William Scheffy, informed Henriksen of his suspicions. On April 17, 1925, William Scheffy was charged with 5 counts, including the murder and attempted assault of Luther and Ada Wells, the murder and the assault of Clyde and Laura Poe, and the break-in at the Reagan home. Again, newspaper accounts described him favorably as a young businessman, war hero that fought bravely with many loyal supporters. Much of his defense was built on him coming from a good family. This goes back to all the way at the beginning when these attacks started. Again, they were attacks on homes with no electricity, so they were basically poorer people. And there were a lot of people who thought that this was going to continue going on unsolved until someone more important or richer was brought into it. So his defense was built largely on him being from a good family and a prominent family. His lawyers promised that some of the best people would provide alibis for him and stated that he was just a pawn in the rivalry between Sheriff McCampbell and current Sheriff Pate. Mrs. Poe, Mrs. Wells, and Ms. Reagan all identified Scheffy's voice in a lineup. However, the way they did this was very controversial. The women were all kept in one room, and Scheffy, having already been arrested, along with several other men, were told that they were going to a medical exam. During the medical exam, the doctor asked them to repeat certain sounds and phrases. It doesn't say, I'm guessing that whatever disease they were trying to check them for, they said was outbreaking, had something to do with voices to make this make sense. But so the women were in the next room listening to multiple men speak, but they did all pick out Scheffy's voice. There was also a problem as for a physical lineup because they were given pictures which included Scheffy in multiple pictures and told to pick out the attacker from one of the people. And so the defense would later on object to this because they were shown pictures and told, your attacker is in this picture. And then they were just told to pick out the man who seemed the most like it. There was also growing frustration on behalf of Maurice Mays and John Honeycutt, who had both been executed and died in prison under suspicion of these crimes, and then these crimes continued going. So that was the climate in which Will Scheffy was being charged. They went through the trial, and I just want to go back to that blog that I was reading, and I'm going to link that blog as well. The trials definitely seems like it was a very interesting, intriguing trial. A lot of back and forth between the lawyers, and just the blog does a really good job of detailing that. W.T. Peace, one of the attorney generals, said that to the men of the jury, there is in the confines of this town a beast, a fiend in human form, who answers that description, who in the small hours of the night has gone from home to home, shooting men and women. Nobody could find him. He was too smart for them, and they watched him night after night, and their reward was a call to come. A home has been invaded, a husband shot, or a woman ravaged. Thomas N. Brown, also for the prosecution in his closing statement, said, for years people here could sleep easy. But in 1919 there came a young man to the county from Seaver, and he did not have such a good reputation. You'll find at the age of 17 he violated the age of consent and was not prosecuted. He faced a charge of murdering a young woman and was acquitted. After this young man came to this county. A home was entered, then another, and for the next 2, 3, 4 years homes were being entered and the community terrorized. That's what you, the jury, are interested in. Then what happened? A young man was arrested, and there hasn't been a marauding case since. The know-it-all gentleman is before you. There he sits, Will Scheffy. But Will Scheffy was acquitted. In the first trial of August 1925, it ended in a mistrial with 7 voting for acquittal and 5 for conviction after 15 hours of deliberation. The judge sent them back to reconsider twice, but they did not change their votes. The second trial was in December of 1925. It added in the charges for breaking into the home of Miss Reba Littlefield and the assault on Miss Ressie Allison. 9 voted to convict and 3 voted to acquit. At this point, they could no longer deny bail, and so a bail hearing was set for January 8th, 1926. Then the third trial. With the third trial, he was finally acquitted. After Will Scheffy was freed, in July of 1926, Sarah Mason was attacked. Again, same hallmarks of a man entering, grabbing her, threatening her, and waking her up with a flashlight and a gun. Will Scheffy had been released from prison, and he had not yet moved. He was planning to start a new life over in California. After he finally did that, the murders and the attacks stopped, and everyone moved on. My question is, did similar killings start in California? It's for this reason I'm looking forward to the book that Dr. Nancy Laughlin-Sofer and her students are hopefully going to put out, hopefully get answers. Within their blog, they have detailed historical research and analysis of current versus modern techniques. They talk about the research in the psychology and roadblocks the investigators may have faced. They talk about the political climate of the time and how that may have factored into the investigation. They go into detail in the attacks, and they have very accurate recountings of them. They go into detail into the courtroom's wild and engaging proceedings. She was helped by local historians and descendants from those who were involved, and has a wealth of primary sources that she is working from. And again, hopefully the answer as to whether or not these crimes started up in California again. So that is the Night Marauders case, and next will be my investigation.
Hi, so this is Megan from Travelers Paranormal. I am here at the Nashville City Cemetery, completing my 17th challenge for the Para Games, sponsored by What the Paranormal. And this challenge is the Serial Killer Challenge. The rules are that I need to have 10 minutes investigating with my S-Box, and then another 5 minutes investigating blindfolded. So I'm going to start out here with my S-Box and not blindfolded. I'm going to walk around the cemetery a little bit so that you can see it. Let me just start my timer. Okay, so cemetery. So the serial killer that I am in, S-Box. I'm going to keep it low, so I'll keep it near the camera for a bunch of the time, just because I'm out in a cemetery and I want to be respectful. So the serial killer that I am investigating is an unsolved crime. It is the Night Marauder. He was active from 1919 to 1926 in East Tennessee, in Knox and Blount County mostly. Is there anyone here who will communicate with me? I just heard it say no. I'm looking for information on the Night Marauder. Is there anyone here who knows anything about the Night Marauder? So this is a cemetery that Joe and I have investigated it before. The reason why we picked this location is there is a section of the cemetery that has wooden markers, and that is because they have Tennessee State Penitentiary inmates buried here that had died of, I think it was a cholera epidemic. So picked this location because there was a gentleman who was tried for one of the Night Marauder murders, and his name was Maurice Mays. Did someone say something? Does that name sound familiar? Maurice Mays was tried for one of Maurice Mays was tried for one of the murders. Sound like it just said yes? It hurts? Maurice Mays was tried and convicted for one of the murders, and he was executed in Nashville at the Tennessee State Prison. Even while his trial was ongoing, more murders took place. So he was wrongfully put to death for these crimes, that crime at least, and so we came here. I don't know where he's buried, but I do know that there are penitentiary inmates here. Yes. So the night Marauder, like I said, was active in East Tennessee. At first he was attacking women and assaulting them or robbing them. And then sometime in 1920 is when he seems to have discovered that he also enjoyed killing them, especially women who screamed and fought back. He would actually attack women, purposely shoot someone else who was in the room, a husband or a sister or a spouse or a cousin or anything. He would shoot the first person and then assault the woman and then kill her. Is there anyone here who knows anything about the night Marauder? Yes? Do you know who the night Marauder was? I think it just said bastard. I certainly think he was. Just something just said cold. Again, we're in a cemetery. Phrase, the cold grave. As we were coming in, there's a building over there, and I thought I had seen a shadow figure across one of the pillars. So this is an old cemetery in Nashville, the city cemetery. I'm not sure, honestly, if it was the first cemetery here, but it is one of the first, if not the first. The city cemetery. while I was researching serial killers to try to pick one for this challenge, I came across a professor in Maryville College, which Maryville is one of the cities where some of the victims are from, and she was teaching a history of murder case class, and while she was doing that, she discovered this case, and her and her students have put together a large project now, researching it, eventually with the hopes of putting out a book. And I know I, for one, am very excited. Thought I just heard a male voice, not on my S-Box. Is there anyone there who can talk to me about the night marauder? I can talk? Do you know any information about the case? I thought it just said speak. I would love to speak with you. I thought it just said spirits here. I thought it just said we can speak. I'm listening. I thought it just said stand here. I will remain here for a moment. I thought I just heard it say my name, actually, in a woman's voice, which is always slightly unnerving when it happens. So one of the things that the professor was talking about with this case specifically that kind of hampered them in finding the killer is that it kind of required a paradigm shift for the police. Up until this point, they mostly believed murder was a crime with a connection to the victim. The idea of there being unrelated murders by the same person was new to them, and so even to the point where the first article that she found was about a mother and daughter that were attacked, and the woman was saying that the attacker was not her I think ex-husband or something like that, but that is who they kept on insisting it must have been. They went through numerous times of accusing different people of the crime. So that's my alarm going off. So that was 10 minutes, unblindfolded. I walked around a little bit, but then we got the message to stay here, so I did stand still. Now I'm going to be blindfolded, and so I'm definitely going to stand still, because I don't want to trip in the cemetery. So that is going to be for 5 minutes. Start the timer. Thought it just said 10. 10 minutes was the previous time. This one's only 5. I thought it just said scared. Could be picking up on a victim of some other crime or just someone. So let me. So this is Megan, blindfolded. Get my Xbox back out of my pocket. I'm still looking for information on the night Marauder, if there's anyone here who would be able to help me. I know there was a man wrongly executed for the crime named Maurice Mays, who was at the Nashville State. I thought it said Kentucky, which, while Kentucky neighbors Tennessee, this was not in counties near Kentucky. I thought it said street. I'm looking for information on the night Marauder. If anyone could help me, I would appreciate it. There are still efforts to clear this man's name. There is a foundation. I'm going to link it in the video, but there's a foundation looking to exonerate him, and they've been trying almost since he was first found guilty, but no governor has done it yet. Governor Bill Haslam said he can't overturn what a jury found 100 years ago. He's the last governor I saw anything on record of, but I'm going to link that foundation. I thought I heard it say thank you. I'm listening if you have anything else to say. I thought it said we have a lot. I'm listening. I have a device in my hand that if you talk, it might be able to let me understand what you're saying. I thought I heard it say, it's cold. Again, cold as the grave, is just saying it for a reason. Also, Tennessee in January, not the warmest. Oh, I thought I heard a child. So I know that there were at least some victims as young as 13 or 14 that were attacked. The 13-year-old, he told, was too young to kill, but not too young to assault. But I just heard it say, get out. I mean no offense, I mean no disrespect. I am hoping for information or help into who the night Marauder was. A bad man, I agree. And I also thought it said terrible. So there was one man tried. He was, I believe it was the mistrial. After he was released, there was one more killing, and then he moved to California and there were no more killings. Not in Tennessee, at least. Is there anyone able to or willing to help me with information about the night marauder? It has suddenly gone very still. Is there someone keeping you from speaking? That is my timer again. So that was odd. Now it's talking again. If anyone was communicating with me, thank you. That was odd. That was something I haven't experienced before. But for much of the time while I was blindfolded, my spirit box kind of was just static. I wasn't getting any words. Again, that's odd for it, but that was the end of my 5 minutes. I'm going to keep on researching the Night Marauder. I'm going to look up that book when they finish. Hopefully the professor prints it. I'm going to link, like I said, that website, the foundation looking to exonerate Maurice Mays. I'm going to link them. I'm going to link the blog that professor had put together. You know, I really love a professor finding a new and interesting way to keep her students interested, and a way to, when you look at it, you'll see it's a way to keep it very relevant to today, even though this is crimes that happened a century ago. So this is Megan from Travelers Paranormal, completing the 17th challenge of the Para Games, the Serial Killer Challenge. And I just want to thank What's the Paranormal for sponsoring these games, for putting it together, and for challenging us to find new and interesting topics and new and interesting ways and things to research while we explore and search for answers. And again, anyone who spoke to me, thank you, and I hope that you are at peace.